I think it's interesting because our minds are fiction and nonfiction, and the bleeding that goes on between the hemispheres, and memory, and what's truth, and fiction and nonfiction, it's all very interesting. It's an interesting conversation. I don't know it's resolvable. What I'm excited by is that the borders between genres are growing more porous, and I think this presents really exciting possibilities for writers. Not to become big liars, you know, not to distort and tweak, but to not feel confined or corralled in a genre. So that when I came to my idea of writing The Long Embrace, I'd never written a nonfiction book before. I'm a novelist, short story writer. But I knew I didn't want to write a biography of Chandler, starting with his grandparents or something. And I knew that I was going to bring a novelist sensibility to the idea of writing biography. And it never occurred to me that I would do otherwise. And that I had a right to do it. And that I wouldn't have to disguise myself. I wouldn't have to pretend that I didn't exist, and that my search for Chandler was going to become part of the story. Especially because Sissy, his wife, was so, if people said she was an enigma, there was so little left to find out about her. And so my thought was, and the way I sold the book was, well, wouldn't the search itself be interesting? Couldn't I make a book about looking for Sissy, trying to connect the dots? That becomes a very different kind of book than I'm going to write a biography. But was I going to make up stuff about Sissy in order to do that? I would find that extremely unethical. On the other hand, I was perfectly happy in one section to indulge the idea of being on a plane going to New York to look at some records and fantasizing being in a room with that man and that woman, that couple, imagining them at night listening to the radio program. And what was their life like? That, it never occurred to me that I wouldn't have a right to sort of fantasize a possibility. It's quite different than passing it off as I was there. And I've already established from the very first sentence, the very first page, it's an I voice, it's a first-person voice. I am your narrator. I am the person through which this story is going to bleed and be revealed. In saying that, I also have to say, when I sold the book, I tried to write it as fiction first, and it didn't work. I gave it to my editor at Pantheon and kind of said, no. So then I gave a talk, 23 pages, about Chandler and his marriage and his wife, about how he used the city, about his 36 moves. I looked at that talk and I said, that's my book. And I sold that book, even though everyone said, well, I don't know about writing a book about Chandler and his marriage because, you know, she's an enigma. But I sold it as a nonfiction book, and then I went home and said, I'm going to do this exactly the way I want to do it. And I'm going to write a chapter of fiction and a chapter of nonfiction. A chapter of fiction. And the fiction was imagining Chandler at the end of his life in La Jolla, a kind of sad alcoholic man who's lost his wife, looking back on his life, puttering around, walking into town for a drink at the Whaling Bar. And then I would go to me, searching for Chandler in LA, telling his story, telling the story of Sissy and their marriage. And I wrote the whole damn book that way. And as I was doing it, I was saying, you're nuts. This is apples and oranges. It's never going to work. I printed the whole thing out and I sat down and read it. And I said, you were right. You're nuts. It doesn't work. It's apples and oranges. But if I just take out every other chapter, if I take out the fiction, I've got my book. And I sent it to my editor at Pantheon, and he read it faster than he's ever read anything, and he really loved it. And I said, I just included these other pages in case, you know, you want to look at them, but I don't think they belong. And he said, they absolutely don't belong, but this is the book. My feeling is I would have never gotten that book if I hadn't written it the way that I did. I wrote it the way I wanted to write it.